The white silk of Aurelia's wedding gown brushed against the cold stone of the conservatory, but the chill in her chest had nothing to do with the drafts of the Knox citadel. Through the parting wisteria vines, she saw them. Her fiancé, Duke Callan, his dark-clad arms wrapped tightly around her younger sister, Lyra. Lyra's face was flushed, her lips parted in a breathless laugh as Callan leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers in an intimacy that belonged solely to a husband. "Just a little longer, my love," Callan whispered, his voice a gravelly caress that shattered Aurelia's world. "Once the ceremony is complete, she will no longer stand between us." Tears pricked Aurelia's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She backed away, her mind spinning with the ultimate betrayal. But as she fled toward the grand staircase to find her father, she had no idea that the shadow of an even greater horror was waiting for her upstairs. The heavy scent of lilies and incense clung to the corridors of the Knox citadel, suffocating Aurelia as she ran. Her hands, trembling against the heavy folds of her bridal skirts, struggled to lift the fabric. Every step felt like wading through deep water. "Just a little longer, my love," the words echoed in her mind, a cruel, mocking refrain. Callan, the dark and enigmatic Duke of Knox, the man she had spent the last year learning to trust, had been holding her sister. Lyra, who had always looked at Aurelia with a thinly veiled envy, had looked at Callan as if he were her entire world. And Callan had looked back with a softness he had never once shown Aurelia. Aurelia's breath hitched. She had believed their upcoming marriage was a true alliance. House Solus, with its fading but pure sun-heart magic, and House Knox, with its decaying shadow weave, joining together to bring balance to the fractured empire. She had allowed herself to believe that the quiet moments they shared, the hushed conversations in the library, the way his hand lingered on her waist during formal dances, meant something. It was all a lie, a carefully orchestrated play to keep her compliant until she walked down the aisle. "I won't do it," she whispered to the empty stone hallway. "I won't let them humiliate me." She needed her father, Lord Valerius. He was the head of House Solus, a man fiercely proud of their lineage. If she told him of Callan's infidelity, he would demand the contract be torn to pieces. He would protect her. He had to. She hurried past the grand hall where guests were already gathering, their laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses filtering through the heavy oak doors. She ascended the spiral staircase of the east tower, heading toward the private guest quarters. The stone grew darker here, absorbing the afternoon light. As she neared her father's chambers, a low, urgent murmur of voices caught her attention. It wasn't coming from her father's room, but from the Duke's private study, the solarum, just across the landing. The door was ajar, a sliver of golden light cutting across the dark floorboards. Aurelia paused. Her father's deep, commanding voice was unmistakable. "The girl's sun heart is fully mature," Lord Valerius was saying. There was no warmth in his tone, only the cold calculation of a merchant assessing livestock. Once the high priest initiates the soul bind at the altar, the siphon will draw her core light out. She won't survive the transition, of course, but Lyra is prepared to take her place immediately to keep up appearances. Aurelia's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "And the Duke?" another voice asked, High Mage Vane, Callan's closest advisor. "Is Callan fully committed? The ritual requires his blood to anchor the transferred magic." "Callan signed the blood contract 3 months ago," Valerius sneered. "He knows his lands are dying. The shadow weave is collapsing. He will do whatever it takes to save Knox, even if it means sacrificing a useless girl who thinks he loves her. Besides, he gets the magic and the sister he actually desires. It's a win for everyone involved." "Except for the bride," Vane murmured. "A small price for the survival of 2 great houses," Valerius replied smoothly. Aurelia felt the room spin. The betrayal downstairs was nothing compared to the abyss opening beneath her feet. Her father was selling her life. Her sister was waiting to step over her corpse. And Callan, the man she was about to pledge her soul to, had signed her death warrant months ago. She took a step back, her mind screaming. She had to get out. She had to run, to escape this fortress of monsters. But as she moved, her heel caught on the edge of the heavy runner carpet. She stumbled, her shoulder colliding with an iron sconce on the wall. It clattered against the stone with a deafening ring. Inside the study, the voices abruptly stopped. "Who's there?" her father's voice barked. Footsteps heavy and swift began heading toward the door. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Aurelia's veins. If she ran down the long, open corridor, they would catch her in seconds. There were no turnings, no hiding places, except for the deep velvet drapes hanging over the high arched windows overlooking the courtyard. With a silent prayer, she threw herself behind the heavy, dust-scented fabric, pulling her voluminous white skirts tight against her body. She pressed her back against the freezing glass of the window, holding her breath until her lungs burned. The study door creaked open. The heavy footsteps of her father stopped just feet from where she stood. "Nothing," Lord Valerius muttered, his voice dripping with irritation. "Just the wind howling through these ancient drafts." "We must be careful, Valerius," Mage Vane cautioned from the doorway. "If the girl suspects anything before the vows are spoken, the magic will resist the siphon. The Sun Heart must be peaceful, willing, and bound to the Duke before we strike." "She suspects nothing," Valerius dismissed. "She is a romantic fool. She thinks she is marrying a dark prince who will learn to love her. Let us finish the preparations." The door closed with a heavy click. Aurelia let out a shuddering breath, her forehead leaning against the cold window pane. The courtyard below was filled with carriages arriving, noble lords and ladies dressed in their finest attire, all here to witness a wedding, to witness her execution. "They think I am a fool," she thought, her fear slowly hardening into a cold, glittering rage. "They think I will walk quietly to the slaughter." She was the daughter of the sun. If they wanted her light, she would make them burn. But she couldn't run. The citadel was locked down for the ceremony, the gates barred to all but invited guests. Her father's guards patrolled the perimeter, and Kaelin's shadow guards watched the halls. If she tried to flee now, she would be captured and locked away, forced into the ritual by restraint rather than deception. She had to play the part. She had to walk to that altar, but she would not go unprepared. Gathering her skirts, she slipped out from behind the curtain and hurried down the back staircase to her bridal suite. Her hands were steady now, fueled by adrenaline. As she rounded the corner to her quarters, a tall, imposing figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking her path. Duke Kaelin. He had changed into his formal wedding attire. A high-collared doublet of midnight black, embroidered with gold thread that caught the dim light like dying embers. His sharp jaw was clean-shaven, his dark hair brushed back, and his storm-gray eyes locked onto hers. "Aurelia," he said, his voice a low baritone that sent a shiver down her spine. "Where have you been? The handmaidens have been searching for you." She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of the monster who had signed her death warrant. He looked flawless, regal, cold. "I needed some air," she said, keeping her voice light, forcing her lips into a shy, breathless smile. "The citadel can feel quite claustrophobic." Kaelin stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You shouldn't wander alone, especially today." "I saw you earlier," she said, watching him closely. "In the conservatory, with Lyra." He froze. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of something raw and painful crossed his features. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. But just as quickly, his mask fell back into place. "You misunderstand what you saw," Kaelin said, his voice stiffening. "I was comforting her. She was anxious about the ceremony and your family's transition to the capital." "Comforting her," Aurelia repeated softly. "And what of us, Kaelin? Do you truly wish for this marriage, or are we merely fulfilling a duty?" Kaelin looked down at her, his gray eyes darkening. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering near her cheek before gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was surprisingly warm, almost reverent, making the betrayal sting even worse. "This marriage is necessary, Aurelia," he said quietly, his gaze intense. "For my people, for the survival of everything I hold dear. Never doubt that I will do what must be done." "To save your lands, you will kill me," she translated mentally. "I understand," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Go," he murmured, his hand falling away. "The high priest is waiting." As he turned to leave, Aurelia felt a strange, localized warmth on her collarbone. She reached up, her fingers brushing the skin. It was a tracking ward, a subtle, invisible brand of shadow magic. Kalen had placed it on her during that brief touch. He was keeping her on a leash. She was his prisoner, and the countdown to her execution had officially begun. The Cathedral of the Nox Citadel was a masterpiece of dark opulence. Black marble pillars stretched toward a vaulted ceiling painted with constellations, while thousands of white candles flickered in the gloom, casting long, dancing shadows. Aurelia stood at the double doors, her face concealed beneath a heavy veil of golden lace. Beneath the silk of her sleeve, her fingers clutched a small, sharp object. It was a silver hairpin, its tip coated in a rare, numbing poison she had extracted from a nightshade root in the conservatory days ago. It wasn't enough to kill a man of Kalen's strength, but it would disrupt his magic. In her mind, her mother's voice whispered from a memory long buried. "The sun heart cannot be taken by force, Aurelia. If they attempt to siphon your light, use the silver. Silver inverts the flow. It turns the siphoner into the vessel, and the vessel into the storm." She had to time it perfectly. The moment the high priest initiated the soulbind, she would strike. The heavy bronze doors swung open. The organ swelled, a dark, solemn melody that felt more like a funeral march than a wedding march. Aurelia stepped forward, her father taking her arm. His grip was tight, a silent warning not to make a scene. "Smile, dearest," Valerius whispered under his breath. "Today is the day you save us all." "I am smiling, father," Aurelia whispered back beneath her veil. As they walked down the aisle, she passed the rows of silent guests. On the right, the lords of Nox, shrouded in dark velvets. On the left, the lords of Solis, glittering in false gold. In the very front row sat Lyra. Her sister was dressed in a gown of pale cream, far too close to white, and her eyes were fixed on Kalen, a smug, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. At the altar stood Duke Kalen. He watched Aurelia approach, his expression unreadable. Beside him, High Mage Vane held a ceremonial obsidian bowl. Valerius handed Aurelia over to Kalen. As their hands met, a spark of static magic jumped between them. Kalen's grip was firm, almost desperate. The high priest raised his hands, his voice echoing through the cathedral. "We gather to bind the sun and the shadow, to weave two bloodlines into one, and secure the eternal prosperity of our realms." The priest began the incantations. Beneath Aurelia's feet, the ancient runes carved into the altar floor began to glow with a sickly, violet light. She felt a sudden, heavy pull at her chest. The siphon was activating. The magic was already reaching for her sun heart, dragging it toward the obsidian bowl. She braced herself, her fingers tightening around the silver pin hidden in her palm. She just needed Kalen to bleed first, to anchor the magic so she could invert the flow. "The blood oath," the priest commanded. Mage Vane stepped forward, presenting a ceremonial silver dagger. Kalen took it. Without hesitation, he sliced his palm, letting his dark, shadow-infused blood drip into the obsidian bowl. He turned to Aurelia, offering the blade. This was her moment. She took the dagger, but instead of cutting her palm, she prepared to plunge the silver hairpin into Kalen's hand to disrupt his channeling. But before she could move, Kalen stepped closer, his body shielding her actions from the congregation. He reached out, his bleeding hand catching her wrist, but he didn't force her hand to the blade. Instead, he leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear through the gold lace of her veil. "When the light flares, run to the eastern gate," he whispered, his voice frantic, raw, and completely devoid of his usual coldness. "Do not look back. I have set a carriage for you. Go." Aurelia's breath caught. What? Before she could process his words, Kalen violently slammed his bleeding hand down onto the altar's central rune. The violet light of the siphon did not gently pull at her. It erupted, but the magic didn't flow toward Kalen. The runes on the floor shattered, turning a bright, blinding crimson. A shockwave of pure, unfiltered energy blasted through the cathedral, throwing the high priest backward. Screams erupted from the congregation. Through the blinding light, Aurelia watched in sheer horror as the crimson siphoning magic violently whipped through the air. It bypassed her completely, arching over the altar like a blood-red whip, and slammed directly into her sister, Lyra, in the front row. Lyra let out an agonizing shriek as her own latent life force was violently pulled from her body, her eyes turning stark white as she collapsed to the floor. "No!" Lord Valerius roared, rushing forward. Kalen grabbed Aurelia's waist, pulling her behind him as the cathedral erupted into utter chaos. "We have to go," he growled. "Now!" The sanctuary of the Knox Cathedral had descended into a waking nightmare. Ash and shattered stained glass rained down like jagged, colorful snow. The air tasted of ozone and burning copper, the raw scent of siphoned life force. Screams ripped through the smoke-choked air as guests trampled one another, fleeing the wrath of a spell gone horribly wrong. Through the haze, Aurelia could still see her sister's pale, lifeless form cradled in their father's arms. Lyra's once vibrant eyes were glassy, staring hollowly at the vaulted ceiling. But Aurelia had no time to process the horror. "Don't look at her," Kalen's voice growled in her ear. His grip around her waist was ironclad, lifting her off her feet as he vaulted over a fallen marble balustrade. "Release me!" Aurelia cried, her fingers clawing at his leather-clad forearm. "She was my sister. What did you do to her?" "I saved your life," Kalen spat, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. "Now hold on if you want to keep it." A squad of Solus guards, their gold and crimson armor gleaming through the smoke, barred the exit to the cathedral's northern transept. They drew their broadswords, their faces twisted in righteous fury. "By order of Lord Valerius, secure the traitor duke and the bride," their captain roared. Kalen didn't hesitate. With his free hand, he tore off his heavy velvet wedding cape and flung it forward. As the fabric cut through the air, he channeled his shadow weave magic. The velvet dissolved into a swarm of razor-sharp obsidian shadows, blinding the guards and sending them screaming to the floor as the darkness sliced through their armor. But the effort clearly cost him. Kalen stumbled, a harsh cough racking his chest. He recovered instantly, dragging Aurelia through the side door and down a dark, narrow servants' corridor. "You're wounded," Aurelia observed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could smell blood, not just his palmar cut from the ritual, but a deeper, sweeter metallic scent. "The backfire," Kalen muttered, pulling her down a flight of spiral stairs. "The siphon was anchored to my blood, sabotaging it, shattered my meridians. But we are not safe yet." They burst out of a heavy wooden door into the crisp, biting air of the eastern courtyard. True to Kalen's whisper, a plain black carriage stood waiting, hitched to two powerful shadow steeds whose hooves bled dark mist. Mage Vane was on the driver's box, his face pale as death. "My lord," Vane called out, "the Solus guards are closing the main gates." "Break through them," Kalen ordered, throwing Aurelia into the carriage and climbing in behind her. Before the door had fully latched, the carriage surged forward with bone-rattling force. Aurelia was thrown against the plush leather seats. She scrambled to the window, watching the grand, dark walls of the Knox citadel recede into the fog. Smoke was still pouring from the cathedral's rose window. She turned her gaze back to Kalen, who sat across from her. The imposing, regal Duke of Knox looked hollowed out. His high-collared wedding doublet was torn, and dark veins of corrupted shadow magic were pulsing visibly along his jawline and throat. "Why?" Aurelia demanded, her voice shaking with a volatile mix of grief, anger, and confusion. She reached up, her fingers grazing the collarbone where the tracking ward still hummed with a faint warmth. You branded me with this ward. You signed a contract to drain my sunheart, and yet, at the last second, you told me to run. Why play the savior now? Kalen leaned his head back against the carriage wall, his eyelids fluttering. I never wanted to kill you, Aurelia. A blood contract doesn't sign itself, Kalen, she hissed, tears finally spilling over her lashes. My father said you signed it 3 months ago. You agreed to trade my life for the survival of your dying lands. Kalen didn't answer. His breathing grew dangerously shallow. Frustrated and desperate for answers, Aurelia reached out and grabbed his hand, the hand he had cut for the blood oath. The moment her skin made contact with his, a violent shockwave of magic traveled up her arm. The tracking ward on her collarbone flared with a blinding golden light. Aurelia gasped as a rush of foreign energy flooded her senses. It wasn't a parasitic drain. It was Kalen's own life force, wrapping around her sunheart like a protective shield. She looked at him in sheer shock. The ward wasn't a leash to keep her prisoner. It was a constant, exhausting siphon in reverse. For the past hour, Kalen had been feeding her his own shadow essence to mask her sunheart's signature, keeping her core stable and protected from the cathedral's siphoning runes. And now, because he had broken the ritual, the backlash was tearing him apart from the inside out. Kalen, she whispered, her anger momentarily eclipsed by horror. You're dying. He offered her a ghost of a smile, his gray eyes cloudy. Then, you are finally free of your monster. His eyes closed, and his head slumped forward into her lap. The carriage came to a halt hours later in the shadow of a weeping willow forest, deep within the forgotten borderlands of Nox. Mage Vane hurried to open the door, his face etched with grim determination. Together, they carried the unconscious Duke into a hidden sanctuary, an ancient subterranean temple dedicated to the primordial deities of sun and shadow. Its stone walls were carved with relief sculptures of eclipses, a fitting sanctuary for 2 warring houses. Vane laid Kalen on a stone altar at the center of the chamber. The Duke's skin was ice cold, his breath rattling in his throat. How do we save him? Aurelia asked, her voice tight. She stood at the foot of the altar, her wedding dress torn and stained with soot. She still held the silver hairpin hidden in her palm. Part of her knew she should walk away, run to freedom. But the revelation of the ward kept her anchored. His shadow core is collapsing, Vane said, his hands trembling as he lit a row of tallow candles. When he sabotaged the siphon, he took the brunt of the magical feedback. It fractured his soul bind. He signed the contract, Vane, Aurelia said, her voice hardening. Explain that to me. If he didn't want me dead, why did he sign my execution order? Vane let out a heavy sigh, looking at his dying lord. Because he was given no choice. Your father, Lord Valerius, didn't just propose an alliance 3 months ago. He brought a hostage. Aurelia's breath hitched. A hostage? Kalen's younger brother, Julian, Vane revealed, his voice cracking. Julian was captured by Solus forces during the border skirmishes. Valerius threatened to slowly drain Julian's life force using an experimental prototype of the siphon unless Kalen signed the marriage contract and agreed to the ritual. Kalen signed it to buy time to find Julian. And the scene in the conservatory? Aurelia asked, her mind racing back to the agonizing image of Kalen and Lyra. I saw them. He called her his love. He told her I wouldn't stand between them much longer. That was a performance. Kalen's voice rasped from the altar. Aurelia flinched. Kalen was awake, his gray eyes cracked open, though they were bloodshot and filled with pain. He struggled to sit up, but Vane gently pressed him back down. Let me speak, Vane, Kalen whispered. He looked at Aurelia, his gaze raw and pleading. Lyra. She knew about the hostage. She was working with your father. She came to the conservatory to taunt me, to remind me that Julian's life depended on my compliance. She knew you were nearby, Aurelia. She saw you coming. She threw herself into my arms and whispered that she would make my brother's death agonizing if I didn't play along. Aurelia felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. So those words, "She will no longer stand between us." "I was referring to your father's leverage," Kalen said, a tear escaping his eye and slipping into his dark hair. "I meant that once the wedding began, my extraction team would have breached Julian's prison, and your father would no longer have anything to hold over us. I was trying to save my brother and you." "But you sabotaged the ritual anyway," Aurelia said, stepping closer to the altar. "Even though you didn't know if Julian was safe." "I received the signal from Vane just before we walked down the aisle," Kalen whispered. "Julian was free, but the high priest had already begun the siphon. I couldn't let it touch you. I redirected the flow into the altar's grounding runes." "Then why did it hit Lyra?" Aurelia asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because your father had altered the array," Kalen said, his expression darkening with a terrifying gravity. "He never intended to just save our houses. He wanted all the power for himself. The siphoning magic didn't misfire, Aurelia. It was programmed to target whoever held the secondary ritual anchor. Lyra was wearing the Solus family crest amulet. She was the backup vessel." Aurelia stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. Her father had set a trap for everyone. He had sacrificed his own younger daughter the moment Kalen disrupted the primary flow. But Kalen's next words made her blood run entirely cold. "But that is not the worst of it," Kalen groaned, clutching his chest as a spasm of dark energy racked his body. "The siphon didn't just drain Lyra's life. It channeled her magic directly upstairs, to the forbidden high tower of the Nox Citadel." "What is in the high tower?" Aurelia asked. "The primeval core," Vane answered, his voice trembling. "An ancient, dormant entity of pure devastation. Your father didn't want to save our lands, Lady Aurelia. He wanted to wake the core to conquer the entire continent. And now, he has the key." Aurelia stood over Kalen, her mind spinning. The scale of the betrayal was staggering. Her father had orchestrated a continental war, using his own daughters as currency and fuel. "We have to stop him," Aurelia said, her voice dropping all traces of vulnerability. She looked at Kalen. "But you can't even stand." "I can fight," Kalen insisted, trying to rise, only to collapse back onto the stone altar with a choked groan. "You can't," Aurelia said. She stepped up to him, looking down at his fractured shadow core. "But I can heal you." "No," Vane warned. "Your Sunheart magic is completely incompatible with his shadow weave. If you try to channel your light into him, you could trigger an annihilation reaction. You'll both blow this sanctuary to pieces." "Not if we invert the flow," Aurelia said, drawing the silver hairpin from her sleeve. She looked Kalen in the eyes. "My mother taught me this before she disappeared. Silver acts as a bridge. It doesn't mix the elements. It allows them to flow in a perfect, coexisting orbit. But it requires absolute trust. If you resist me, Kalen, we both die." Kalen looked at the silver pin, then up at her face. Despite the agony he was in, his gaze was unwavering. "I have trusted you since the moment you agreed to marry a monster like me. Do it." Aurelia took a deep breath. She pressed the silver pin into the palm of her hand, slicing her skin, then pressed her bleeding palm against Kalen's wounded hand. She closed her eyes and reached deep into her chest, finding the golden, radiant heat of her Sunheart. Slowly, carefully, she let it flow down her arm, through the silver bridge, and into Kalen's icy chest. For a terrifying second, Kalen's body went rigid. A low, agonizing growl tore from his throat as the gold and shadow clashed. But Aurelia didn't pull back. She leaned closer, pressing her forehead against his, whispering, "Let me in, Kalen. Trust the light." With a ragged gasp, Kalen let his defenses drop. The clashing magic smoothed out. The golden light of her Sunheart began to orbit his dark shadow core, stabilizing the fractures, binding his broken meridians. It was a beautiful, dizzying dance of cosmic forces, a true eclipse. When Aurelia opened her eyes, she was breathless, her skin glowing with a soft, ethereal radiance. Kalen's gray eyes were clear, his dark veins receding. He looked at her with an intensity that made her chest ache with a sudden, overwhelming longing. "You saved me," he murmured, his hand wrapping around hers, no longer cold, but warm and alive. "We save each other," she corrected softly, pulling her hand back to maintain her emotional guard. "But we still have a battle to fight." Hours later, cloaked in the shadows of Kalen's restored magic, they snuck back into the Nox citadel. The grand fortress was eerily quiet, the guests having fled or been locked in their quarters. The air was heavy, vibrating with a low, sickening hum that vibrated through the stones. They bypassed the lower levels, heading straight for the east tower, the grand staircase that led to the private chambers, and ultimately, the high tower above. As they reached the heavy brass doors of the forbidden high chamber, Aurelia's heart pounded. She prepared herself to face her father, to demand justice for Lyra and herself. Kalen drew his shadow blade, the dark steel humming with suppressed power. "Are you ready?" "Ready," she whispered. Kalen kicked the doors open. The chamber was massive, filled with ancient, whirring machinery of brass and obsidian. At the center of the room, suspended in a giant glass crucible filled with shimmering, siphoned gold and purple liquid, was Lyra. Her sister's body was pale, her hair floating in the fluid, her chest rising and falling in a slow, unnatural rhythm. She was being used as a living battery. Standing in front of the crucible was Lord Valerius, his hands covered in glowing crimson runes. But he was not alone. Standing beside him, holding an ancient grimoire of shadow magic, was a woman dressed in elegant, high-born robes. Her face was mature, beautiful, and utterly chilling in its coldness. Aurelia's breath caught in her throat. Her knees went weak, and she had to grab Kalen's arm to keep from falling. "Mother?" Aurelia whispered. The woman looked up from the book, her eyes glowing with the same golden light as Aurelia's, but devoid of any warmth. She offered a cold, satisfied smile. "Hello, Aurelia," her mother said smoothly. "I see you finally brought us the Duke's blood. We were wondering when you would arrive." The air in the high tower was so thick with the scent of ozone and burning copper that it clung to the back of Aurelia's throat like ash. She stared at the woman standing beside her father, the woman whose gentle lullabies had once comforted her, whose disappearance had left a gaping wound in her childhood. Lady Eleanor of House Solus, her mother. "Mother?" Aurelia's voice was barely a whisper, a fragile thing that seemed to shatter against the cold brass machinery of the chamber. "You're alive. Father said you died when the shadow weave first began to decay." Eleanor smiled, but the expression was entirely hollow. There was no maternal warmth in her golden eyes, only the clinical calculation of a master artisan admiring a well-kept tool. "Died?" Eleanor chuckled, a melodic, chilling sound. "No, my darling child. I simply transcended. Your father and I realized long ago that the fading light of House Solus and the decaying shadow of House Nox were symptoms of a dying world. The only way to survive the coming collapse was to wake the primeval core, but doing so required a vessel of pure, matured sun-heart magic, a vessel I could not provide myself, as my own core had already begun to degrade." She gestured toward Aurelia's chest, where the golden light of her sun-heart hummed. "I planted my light inside you, Aurelia. You were my garden. I left you to grow, to let your magic mature in the fertile soil of your romantic illusions. And look how beautifully you have bloomed." Aurelia felt a sickening wave of nausea wash over her. Her entire life, her grief, her longing for her mother, her belief in her family's honor, was a lie. She was not a daughter. She was a crop. "And Lyra?" Aurelia choked out, her gaze darting to the glass crucible where her younger sister floated, unconscious, her life force being slowly drawn out in golden purple threads. "She worshipped you. She did everything Father asked because she thought she was saving our house." Lyra was eager to please, but ultimately mediocre. Lord Valerius sneered, stepping forward. His hands glowed with the raw, angry crimson of the siphon runes. She believed she would marry Kaelin and rule a restored Nox. She had no idea she was merely the secondary anchor. Her light was meant to prime the machine. Yours, Aurelia, is the key that unlocks the core. You are monsters, Kaelin growled. He stepped in front of Aurelia, his shadow blade humming with a fierce protective resonance. The dark steel of his sword cast long, shifting shadows across the brass-plated floor. I will tear this tower down before I let you touch her. A noble sentiment, Duke Kaelin, Eleanor said smoothly, raising her hands. But you are running on borrowed light. My daughter's healing magic may have stabilized your meridians, but it cannot save you from the blood contract you signed. The blood of House Nox has already anchored the ritual. Your life is forfeit the moment we initiate the final draw. Eleanor opened the ancient grimoire of shadow magic. She began to chant in a low, guttural language that made the stones beneath their feet vibrate. Suddenly, the crimson runes on the floor flared to life. Aurelia felt an agonizing pull in her chest, a sensation like a physical hook wrapping around her sun heart and dragging it forward. Kaelin lunged toward Eleanor, but Valerius slammed his hands onto the floor. A barrier of solid, blood-red light erupted between them, throwing Kaelin backward. He crashed against a brass pillar, a sharp gasp of pain escaping his lips as the open cut on his palm began to bleed profusely. The blood defied gravity, flowing upward in dark, liquid ribbons toward the glass crucible. "No!" Aurelia cried, rushing to Kaelin's side. "The blood is anchored," Eleanor proclaimed, her eyes glowing with a blinding, terrifying gold. "The siphon is complete. Let the core awaken." The massive glass crucible at the center of the chamber began to violently shake. The liquid inside, a swirling vortex of Lyra's siphoned life force and Kaelin's shadow blood, began to boil. Above the crucible, a massive dormant sphere of ancient obsidian, the primeval core, began to crack, revealing a core of pure, terrifying white light that threatened to consume everything. "The seal is breaking," Valerius laughed, his face illuminated by the blinding glare. "The continent will kneel before us." Beside Aurelia, Kaelin struggled to his feet. His skin was turning a ghostly, translucent pale, his shadow magic flickering weakly like a dying candle. He looked at the cracked obsidian sphere, then down at Aurelia. "Aurelia," he whispered, his storm-gray eyes filled with a desperate, tragic resolve. "You have to run. The feedback, it's going to vaporize this entire citadel. If I throw myself into the crucible's core, my collapsing shadow weave might smother the reaction long enough for you to escape." "No!" Aurelia grabbed his arm, her fingers sinking into his doublet. "I just saved you. I am not letting you throw your life away." "It's the only way," Kaelin said, his voice breaking. He reached up, gently cupping her cheek with his trembling hand. "I brought this darkness to your doorstep. I signed that contract out of fear for my brother, but in doing so, I endangered you. Let me make it right. Let me save you, even if it's the last thing I do." Aurelia looked from Kaelin's pleading eyes to the agonizing sight of her sister Lyra, whose face was contorted in pain inside the glass chamber, to her mother's triumphant, cold expression. "I am not a victim," Aurelia's mind roared. "I am not a sacrifice to be bartered, and I am not a helpless girl to be saved at the cost of the man I love." She remembered her mother's long-ago lesson, the one piece of truth hidden in a lifetime of deception. Silver inverts the flow. It turns the siphoner into the vessel, and the vessel into the storm. She looked at the silver hairpin still clutched in her hand, stained with her own blood from healing Kaelin. She didn't need to destroy the magic. She needed to redirect it. But to do that, she had to connect all of them: the siphoner, the vessel, the anchor, and the battery. "Kaelin," she said, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "Trust me one more time. Do not fight the connection." Before he could answer, Aurelia lunged forward. She bypassed the blood-red barrier, using the remnant of Kaelin's shadow magic that still orbited her sun heart to slip through the magical ward. She reached the central brass conduit of the crucible. With a cry of determination, She drove the silver hairpin directly into the main magical junction, slicing her palm open as she did so. "What are you doing?" Eleanor screamed, her chant faltering as the golden-purple liquid in the crucible suddenly stopped flowing toward the core. "I am changing the terms of our contract," Aurelia hissed. She closed her eyes and unleashed the full, unbridled power of her sun heart. But instead of letting it be drawn out, she used the silver bridge to pull. She pulled on Kaelin's shadow magic, weaving it with her light. She pulled on Lyra's fading life force, stabilizing her sister's core. And then, through the connection of their shared bloodline, she reached out and grabbed the magic of her mother. Eleanor gasped, her eyes widening in sudden, absolute terror, as she felt her own immense, ancient magical reserves being violently dragged out of her body. "No! Stop this!" Eleanor screamed, clawing at her chest as golden light erupted from her skin, flowing in thick, luminous rivers toward the silver pin Aurelia held. "You cannot control this power. It will consume you." "I am not trying to control it," Aurelia shouted over the roaring wind of the magical storm. "I am letting it go." Beside Eleanor, Valerius tried to strike Aurelia down, but Kaelin, energized by the massive influx of balanced eclipse magic flowing through the silver bridge, intercepted him. With a powerful sweep of his shadow blade, Kaelin shattered Valerius's crimson runes, sending the corrupt Lord of Solace crashing into the whirring machinery. The brass gears ground to a halt, trapping Valerius beneath their heavy weight. Aurelia channeled the colossal torrent of energy. She did not keep it for herself. She channeled the stolen light of her mother back into the glass crucible, shattering the glass and gently lowering a gasping, unconscious Lyra to the floor. Then, she directed the remaining, volatile power of the primeval core back into its obsidian shell, using the silver pin to invert the siphon's polarity. The core, starved of its catalyst and overwhelmed by the combined force of sun and shadow, began to implode. "Aurelia!" Kaelin cried, rushing to her side. He wrapped his arms around her, adding his own shadow weave to her light to form a protective cocoon around them. With a final deafening crack, the primeval core collapsed in on itself, sealing the ancient entity of devastation forever into a harmless, inert sphere of dark stone. The shock wave blasted through the chamber, shattering the rest of the tower's windows and scattering the heavy fog that had hung over the Nox citadel for centuries. For the first time in generations, the warm, brilliant rays of a true sunrise pierced through the high-arched windows, bathing the ruined room in gold. Eleanor fell to her knees, her hair turned stark white, her eyes dull and completely drained of magic. She looked at her hands, trembling and powerless, before slumping against the altar, ruined by her own insatiable greed. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of ragged breathing. Aurelia stood in the center of the ruins, her torn wedding gown stained with ash and blood, but her posture was unbroken. She looked down at her hands, then at Kaelin, who was still holding her. He stepped back slowly, giving her space, though his storm-gray eyes were filled with an intense, unreadable emotion. He looked healthy, his shadow core stabilized and humming in a gentle, permanent orbit with the remnants of her light. "Is it over?" a weak voice called out. Aurelia turned. Lyra was sitting up, coughing up water and clutching her chest. Her sister looked at Aurelia, her eyes wide with fear, confusion, and a sudden crushing realization of what her ambition had almost cost them. "Aurelia," Lyra whispered, tears filling her eyes. I'm sorry. I thought..." Aurelia walked over to her sister. She did not hug her, nor did she offer words of easy forgiveness. The betrayal was too deep, the wounds too fresh. But she knelt beside her, checking her pulse, ensuring she was out of danger. "You will live, Lyra," Aurelia said quietly. "But the path to rebuilding what we lost starts with the truth. No more lies. No more shadows." She stood and turned to Kaelin. The Duke of Nox stood before her, no longer a dark prince hiding behind masks, but a man who had faced his demons and was willing to accept whatever judgment she passed. "And us?" Kalen asked, his voice low and vulnerable. The contract is destroyed. You are free, Aurelia. You owe me and my people nothing. Aurelia looked out at the sunrise, the golden light reflecting off the silver hairpin she still held. She looked back at Kalen, seeing the honesty and devotion in his eyes, a devotion he had earned through sacrifice, not just empty promises. We have a continent to rebuild, Kalen, she said, a small, genuine smile finally touching her lips. And 2 houses to lead. I think we should do it together, not as prisoners of a blood contract, but as equals. Kalen stepped forward, his hand gently finding hers, their fingers interlocking. As the sun rose higher, casting their joined shadow across the stone floor, Aurelia knew that the shattered alliance of their families was gone. In its place, a new empire, built on trust and a love forged in the fires of betrayal, was finally beginning to dawn. What a breathtaking journey. Aurelia and Kalen's story reminds us that true strength doesn't come from the power we hold over others, but from the trust we build together in the face of absolute betrayal. Aurelia refused to be a victim, and in doing so, she rewrote her own destiny and saved the realm. If you loved this thrilling tale of romance, secrets, and redemption, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your favorite scene, and share it with your fellow story lovers. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another captivating story. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next adventure.